The Man Who Feared Masks, and The Vampire Bat. Written by Joseph Payne Brennan and told to you by Edward E. French. Mr. Appendee was terrified by masks or false faces of any type. Halloween to him was an idiot's festival of unmitigated horror. He would sooner enter a tiger's lair than attend a masked ball. If he saw a false face harmlessly dangling in the window of a novelty shop, he would shudder and turn away. The memory of it would haunt him all evening long, even intrude in his dreams and torment him until he awoke limp with nightmare panic. The detailed circumstances surrounding the inception of Mr. Appendee's mask fear were somewhat hazy, since he was scarcely 3 years old at the time. But the particular moments of terror he remembered vividly, as if they had transpired within his recent adult life. He was sitting in a huge circus tent with his father. It was his first circus. He was enormously excited, tense, somewhat fearful. He held tight to his father's hand. Suddenly all the lights went out. There were screams, frightened cries, roars, howls, and monstrous bellowings. People began pushing and shoving, trying to force passage toward the entrances of the pitch-black tent. In the whirlwind commotion, he lost his grip on his father's hand. He was swept away in a trampling, cursing tide of sweating humanity. He fell down between the seats, screaming. And suddenly out of the darkness appeared a nightmare face, luminous with a green silvery shine, huge of nose, gashed by great white rubbery lips which writhed with insane merriment. The face bent over him, with its tiny glittering eyes, its fearful pink mouth and greasy shine. His screams of a few moments before turned to delirious shrieks of ultimate terror. He remembered nothing more. Eventually, of course, the lights went back on, and the masked circus clown returned a screaming and hysterical child to its father. The child screamed all the way out of the circus tent, screamed all the way home, and screamed and sobbed half the night until exhaustion brought hypnotic sleep. The distressed parents finally forgot the unfortunate incident, but the child never did. In the recesses of his memory, a grotesque and hideous mask wavered always just out of sight, awaiting its chance to loom out of the darkness, awaiting the sudden unexpected moment when it would leap into light and petrify him with pure terror. The show window of a toy store might bring it lunging out at him. He might be swept with acute panic upon glancing up at a billboard advertising a traveling sideshow. Once he nearly fainted on the street when a weirdly masked man from Mars, advertising a local movie, strode around a corner in front of him. The fear remained with him through his childhood, through his adolescence, and on into full maturity. It seemed impervious to the rationalizing of his adult years. It would not be argued away. Its roots had pierced the psychic marrow of his being and resisted all his efforts to wrench them out. The obsessive fear haunted him to such an extent that he finally consulted a reputable psychiatrist. The psychiatrist patiently heard him out, and then painstakingly explained in simple layman language that his early childhood experience had made an impact on his impressionable, too vulnerable young mind, all out of proportion to its actual importance. He pointed out that the mask fear was far more than a physical one. True, the child had been buffeted by the circus crowd, had been shoved and pushed down between the seats, painfully and perhaps severely bruised. But the fear went deeper than that. When the lights in the circus tent went out, the child had been holding tight to his father's hand. The father represented security, comfort, protection, home. Suddenly the child was hurled into milling blackness, and then out of the darkness appeared a hideous, leering face which bore down on him with apparent evil intent. So, the psychiatrist explained, in Mr. Apondi's subconscious mind, the mask, or any mask, had come to symbolize the loss of security, of stability and protection. It symbolized all of the inherited and acquired fears which lurked in Mr. Apondi's own psychic depths. Mr. Apondi listened, and he was impressed. He felt better. He believed that he now thoroughly understood the origin of the mask terror, and an understanding, he judged, was exorcism. But this was only partially true. Although the explanation tended to alleviate Mr. Apondi's mask fear, it by no means entirely dispelled the fixation. The fear remained buried deep in Mr. Apondi's psychic being, and even though it no longer flickered into furious life at the smallest draught of provocation, still it went on smoldering. In his early 30s, Mr. Apondi got married, and if his marriage had its occasional ups and downs, it was probably no better and no worse than the average. All considered, it might be termed reasonably successful. Probably Mr. Apondi believed it far more successful than did his spouse. Mrs. Apondi was frequently exasperated by her husband's lack of enterprise, by his timidity, and by his tendency to accept rather than alter his lot. But after the first few years she seldom complained. It did no good, and in any case Mr. Apondi had plenty of laudable qualities. Although his job was a modest one, he worked steadily at it. He didn't drink, nor stay out at night, nor grumble about the meals. Mr. Apondi himself was quite satisfied with his circumstances. He had a faithful wife, a small but neat apartment home, and a job which was probably his as long as he wanted it, providing he was willing to forego any prospect of raises within the foreseeable future. All in all, he felt that he possessed a measure of security. He never mentioned the mask fear to his wife. He had an uncomfortable feeling that she would consider it silly, that she might even ridicule him. It was, after all, an awkward thing to explain to anyone, and Mr. Apondi could see no point in broaching it. If Mrs. Apondi had known about it, the chances are the surprise birthday party for Mr. Apondi would have been staged in a far less fanciful manner. Actually, the introduction of the masks was an afterthought. The 5 couples and Mrs. Apondi were crowded into the Apondis' small apartment late one October afternoon. A big birthday cake covered with pink icing and candles rested on a table in the living room. It was Mr. Apondi's birthday, and they meant to surprise him when he came home from work at 5:30. Suddenly, young Mrs. Tyler had an idea. She was giving a Halloween masquerade party later in the month, she said, and that very afternoon she had been out shopping for masks. She had them with her now. Why didn't they each put on a mask before Mr. Apondi came in? It would be great fun. For a minute he wouldn't know who any of them were, and that would add to the element of surprise. They all, including Mrs. Apondi, agreed with enthusiasm. Then a further eerie touch was added when ferbile Mr. Fentonby suggested that they put out all the lights in the apartment, except in the vestibule, pull down the shades, and hold lighted birthday candles near their masked faces. When Mr. Apondi first came in, they would remain silent, and he would be confronted by nothing but an assemblage of weird glowing masks, hovering, as it were, in mid-air. Mr. Fentonby's suggestion was adopted with shouts of delight. At 5:15, they slipped on their grotesque false faces, snapped out all the lights, and got their little candles ready. 10 minutes later, they drew the shades, lit their candles, and waited breathlessly like mischievous children. The minutes dragged, but presently they heard the click of the self-service elevator down the hall, and then Mr. Apondi's light but steady tread. He was, as a matter of fact, slightly late. Work had piled up at the office, and he was more tired than usual. Opening the door into the tiny vestibule of his apartment, he sighed with contentment and relief. After hanging up his hat and coat, he strolled into the living room. In that impossibly black place, 11 luminous nightmare masks floated suddenly out at him. They gleamed and flickered in an unearthly light, all their own. The masks were all different, but they were all hideous and malevolent. Some had huge drooping noses, some great white rubbery lips, grinning with insane merriment. Some had tiny glittering eyes and fearful pink mouths. For one terrible moment, Mr. Apondi stood frozen and speechless. Then he began to scream. He screamed and kept on screaming, and shouts of "Surprise!" died in 11 throats, which were in turn suddenly stricken silent. Candles were dropped, and some of the masks. But too late. Mr. Apondi plunged like a maddened thing through the darkened room. He headed for the only glimmer of natural light which was visible, a window. He hurled himself through it, shade and all. And he was still screaming when he struck the cement walk, 7 stories below. I was in the Amazon collecting background material for a projected series of stories and travel articles, and I was to join a government exploring party at a small native settlement 200 miles north of Coyaba. When I arrived at the settlement, I was very much surprised to see a white man sitting on the screened-in veranda of a shack some distance from the huddle of native huts. The government party was not due to arrive until the next day, and I had no idea that a white man was living at the settlement. He walked out to meet me and introduced himself as Cecil Hubers. He said that he had been staying at the settlement for nearly 6 months and that he represented a South American pharmaceutical firm which was endeavoring to establish a permanent base in that area. He was middle-aged, gaunt and faded-looking, with an expression of chronic weariness etched on his wan face. A huge, high-crowned straw hat accentuated the strained lines of his pinched countenance. He acted jumpy and nervous. He was certainly a pathetic figure, and I felt sorry for him. But he seemed sincerely glad to see me, and he was hospitable enough. After I had washed and taken some food, I sat on his screened porch, and he talked. He said that except for the natives, he was alone for months at a time. The company he worked for had parties further in the interior, but they remained in the jungles for long periods, collecting roots and herbs and bark which were used to concoct precious drugs. He had come down from Panama some years before with a fair grubstake, he said, but he had lost his money in a mining venture, and since then he had drifted from one poor-paying job to another. When the pharmaceutical company offered him work at the settlement, he was flat broke and he had accepted it. His job was easy enough. He had to store and check supplies, list and pack outgoing raw materials, and recruit and pay the native guides. But it was obvious to me that there was some aspect of the job, or of the locale, which he detested. After he had talked for nearly an hour, I finally learned what was preying on his mind. He lived in constant fear of a vampire bat, which he said was systematically draining him of blood and life. I say bat, not bats, because he had a weird conviction that a single bat was to blame. When he first mentioned the bat, he made some effort to describe his predicament in a detached and objective manner, but it was impossible for him to do so. He became emotional. His voice grew shrill, and I thought that he was about to leap out of his chair. "If I don't find out how it's getting to me, that bat will bleed me to death," he cried. "I've already lost half my blood. Half of it, I tell you." He became so agitated at one point, I thought I might actually have to restrain him from some violent action. Finally he calmed down a little, and I managed to change the subject. He certainly looked anemic, but I found it hard to believe that he was not exaggerating about the bat. Contrary to popular superstition, vampire bats are not immense flapping horrors which rob their victims of quarts of blood in a single night. The vampire bat is a small creature, scarcely 2 inches long. Its capacity is obviously determined by its own dimensions. That is not to say that the vampire should be considered a gruesome but harmless pest. Although the vampire's capacity is limited, this little light-hating bat makes a circular incision in its slumbering victim's flesh with such precision and stealthy finesse that the sleeper rarely awakens. After the vampire laps up its fill of blood and flies away, blood usually continues to flow from the wound. It is this continuing flow of blood which ordinarily awakens the victim. By the time the victim becomes fully alert, however, he may have lost much more blood than the bat itself has actually absorbed. Although I knew of well-authenticated instances in which both animals and men had been seriously weakened by attacks of the vampire bat, I decided that my host's fear of being bled to death was largely groundless. I felt that he actually had been attacked by a vampire bat sometime in the past, and that the experience had proved so revolting and even terrifying he had suffered a kind of traumatic shock. Now the vampire bat had become an obsession which was never out of his mind. Loss of sleep and morbid nagging fear had turned him into a physical and mental wreck. I accepted his invitation to set up my cot and mosquito net in his shack that night. Before he blew out the kerosene lantern, I witnessed a prolonged performance which was both ludicrous and disturbing. For the space of 2 hours, my host inspected the floors, walls, and ceiling of the screened shack. Inch by inch his eyes searched every plank and every screen. He had apparently done this many times before, and although at the end of his inspection he had not found a single crack or aperture of any kind, he did not appear to be particularly relieved. Certainly if any means of ingress originally existed, it must have long since been sealed up. I did not see how a fair-sized insect could squirm inside. But when my host finally, for the first time I believe, removed his huge straw hat, placed it on a shelf, and crawled under his mosquito net, he still wore a worried frown. I had had a tiring day and fell asleep soon afterwards. About 3 hours later, I was awakened by a hair-raising scream. I sat up and stared around in the blackness. My heart was pounding. I thought that a bushmaster or some other deadly kind of snake had gotten into the shack. Cecil Hubers moaned in the nearby darkness. "The vampire!" he cried. "It's been at me again!" He began to whimper like a sick child. I felt sure that he had merely experienced a recurrent nightmare, but nevertheless I got up and lit the kerosene lantern. When I brought it to his cot, I gasped. He was staring down at a tiny circular incision on the top of his foot where the blood was still flowing. I was more shaken by the sight of blood trickling out of that little hole than I have been at the sight of gory accidents. I suggested that we both undertake an immediate search of the shack. If the bat was still inside, we would find it and kill it. He shook his head and moaned again. "It's no use. They can't stand light. As soon as you lit the lantern, it got out." He finally arose, bathed and bandaged the puncture on his foot, and sank back on his cot. He left the lantern lit and lay there with his eyes wide open. He looked so haunted and unhappy I wished I could say something to cheer him up, but for the life of me I couldn't think of anything that made sense. I stayed awake for a while trying to figure out how the bat had gotten in. But I had watched Hubers inspect the interior of the closely screened building inch by inch a few hours before, and I couldn't think of a single corner or chink that he might have missed. Finally sleep overcame me again. When I got up the next morning, my host was sitting on the veranda. He looked even worse than he had the night before. His face was ghastly, really gray and drawn, and his eyes appeared feverish. I knew without asking that he hadn't slept again after the vampire's attack. After breakfast, I suggested that he ask the pharmaceutical company to transfer him to some other locality. "I haven't enough strength left to go out in the jungle with the gathering parties," he said. "And there isn't anything else." He said nothing more. His tense agitation of the previous day appeared to be changing into a sort of fatalistic apathy. I felt seriously concerned about him, and I wished I might help. but I didn't know what to do. The party I was to accompany arrived by mid-morning, and soon afterwards I bid Cecil Hubers goodbye. He wished me good luck, and shook hands in a perfunctory manner. At the edge of the jungle I turned around. He was slumped down in his chair on the veranda. All I could see of him was his pinched white face under the brim of his immense cone-shaped hat. He didn't bother to wave. Nearly 2 months passed before I returned to the settlement on my way back to Coyaba. I had separated from the government party several days before, and I arrived with my own Indian guides. I immediately crossed to Cecil Hubers' shack. He was not on the veranda. I went up the 3 steps and rapped on the screen door. A short, swarthy man who looked part Indian and part Portuguese got up from a cot inside and came to the screen. I asked for Mr. Hubers. "He's dead," the dark man said in good English. Somehow I'd expected it, but I was still startled. "What happened?" I inquired bluntly. The man rolled his thick shoulders as if explanations were distasteful to him. "The little bat took too much blood," he said. "One morning they found him dead on his bed." "How horrible!" "I'm very sorry," I said, and I meant it. There was something more I wanted to know. "Did they ever find out how the bat got in?" I asked. The man rolled his shoulders again. "It didn't get in," he said. "It was in all the time. It was living in his hat." I stared at him, and I suspect my mouth fell open. He nodded. "The bat clung by day in the top of Mr. Hubers's funny big hat. He never took his hat off, except at bedtime. It was always dark inside. At night the vampire came out and fed on him. After he was dead, we found the bat asleep in the top of his hat on the shelf. It was a very fat bat, and we killed it." I stood there on the porch remembering Cecil Hubers's huge, high-crowned, cone-shaped straw hat, the hat that left his head only just before he crawled under his mosquito net at night. In spite of the close, moist warmth of that clearing, I felt myself enveloped by an eerie chill. "It's unbelievable," I muttered half to myself. The dark man turned from the door with a shrug. "He's dead," he grumbled. The Man Who Feared Masks and the Vampire Bat, written by Joseph Payne Brennan and read for you by Edward E. French. These recordings are copyright 2025 by Edward E. French, all rights reserved. Inquiries should be addressed to email edwardfrench06@hotmail.com. Good night.